Daoism, and modern China. Today, we will use Ah Cheng's story about the Cultural Revolution as a starting point for our discussion. Obviously, the Cultural Revolution was one very important but very unusual event in the history of modern China, and China's political culture today is very different. The Cultural Revolution and Ah Cheng's story makes a good starting point for discussion because that period was so firmly gripped by an ideology of opposition to every form of traditional culture, and highlights the possible difficulties of appealing to an ancient philosophical tradition in the modern world. After discussing this story, we can then think about whether Ah Cheng's conclusions still apply in the 21st century. Before we get to the story, let's go over some background about the Cultural Revolution, what it was and what it meant. Now, originally, this is a movement launched in 1966 by Chairman Mao Zedong to sideline what he saw as potential challenges to his leadership from within the Chinese Communist Party. But rather than fighting these challenges behind the scenes, in private, Mao enlisted mass support by effectively creating his own cult of personality, especially among teenagers and young adults in their early 20s. These young people were encouraged to rise up and attack authority figures, including teachers and their own parents, but also members of the party bureaucracy that Mao saw as his personal enemies. The most fanatical pro-Mao teens organized themselves into groups of what were called Red Guards, who took it upon themselves to enforce the most extreme forms of ideological purity. People were labeled counter-revolutionary on the smallest pretext, and they were publicly humiliated while their possessions were destroyed. Also, the Red Guards went around destroying much of China's classical heritage, not just burning books, but also burning temples and destroying priceless works of art. All of this was encouraged by government media. By 1968, there was fighting in the streets of Beijing between different Red Guard groups, each of which claimed to love Chairman Mao the most. By that time, these groups had already served their purpose of helping Mao to consolidate power within the Central Party administration. And as they were causing too much chaos, he then declared that they should be sent down to the countryside to learn from the peasants. These naive young people were initially enthusiastic, but as the months and then years passed, they grew disillusioned with the reality of rural poverty and the difficult physical labor they had to endure. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was exhausted. Families had been torn apart, millions had had their lives upturned, and the country was suffering from the effects of a decade of disruption to education, government, and the economy. By 1978, those leaders whom Mao had purged had taken back power. Under the rule of Deng Xiaoping, a policy of reform and opening was begun which loosened cultural controls, discouraged fanaticism, and created the basis for China's market economy, which has continued to the present day. In order to support this transition away from the most fanatical version of Maoism, the new leadership under Deng encouraged the development of a new literary movement called scar literature, which narrated the traumas which had been inflicted upon Chinese society during the Cultural Revolution. The author whom you read for today, Ah Cheng, was an important member of this scar literature movement. Ah Cheng is still alive, and he continues to write, although Mostly he writes screenplays nowadays. But he's primarily known for his trilogy of short stories set during the Cultural Revolution: King of Chess, King of Trees, and King of Children. These were based upon his own experiences during the Cultural Revolution. He was a sent-down youth of a sort. He was an unusually privileged one. At the time, he was actually an art student, and he was sent down to 3 different places in rural China to paint essentially propaganda posters praising the work of the other sent-down youths who were actually doing the labor. Ah Cheng was actually born in 1949, the same year that the Chinese Civil War ended and the Communist Party took control of China. He was the son of one of China's most influential film critics, a man named Zhong Dianfei, who himself had had a strong classical education. And moreover, Zhong Dianfei had a particular interest in Daoism and the early Taoist classics, and he taught these to his son. King of Trees, in particular, shows this influence the most strongly, and it's one of the most interesting post-Mao literary appropriations of Zhuangzi. The basic setting and plot of King of Trees are fairly simple. A group of sent-down youth arrive at the mountains near China's border with North Korea, and they begin to learn how to cut down trees. Their local guide, Na Bixiao, has a particular respect for one huge tree which grows on a mountaintop and tries to keep the young arrivals from cutting it down. The student's leader, a young man named Li Li, insists that the tree must be cut down as a way of attacking superstitious reverence for old things, which is harmful to the modern socialist culture which China needs to build. Eventually, they do cut down the tree, and soon afterwards, Na Bixiao also dies. Now, at the beginning of this story, Na Bixiao, whose name would probably more literally be translated Pimple Xiao or Xiao Geda, seems to represent a local peasant woodcutter who is actually there to help the sent-down youth acclimate to local conditions. It's only midway through the story that we learn that Xiao is originally from southwest China, and he is a heroic Korean War veteran who was forced to resign from the army without being at fault, and who is actually under a cloud of suspicion for not being sufficiently pliant to the Maoist order. And it's only near the end of the story that we learn that this name, the King of Trees, is a nickname properly applied to Xiao rather than to the huge tree itself. But then again, these are deliberately confused, so that Na Bixiao seems to have developed a supernatural connection to the tree. When it is killed, he dies as well. In very loose terms, most readers without deep knowledge of the Zhuangzi should still be able to get a basic message from the story. The Cultural Revolution could not accept great individuals and ended up destroying them in the name of progress. However, the story has more complex themes which become clear when considering the allusions to the Zhuangzi. There are several allusions to the Zhuangzi in King of Trees. You may remember at the beginning of the story we see Na Bixiao cutting up a piece of wood, and one of the students remarks, "He's like a cook chopping up beef." In the Chinese original, this is even clearer. It says explicitly that Na Bixiao is just like Bao Ding cutting up the ox. In other words, directly referencing the Zhuangzi story. Next, we have the characters Pimple Xiao and his son, Six Claws Xiao. You may remember that there are several stories in the Zhuangzi about people with physical deformities, and that these people are actually praised. There's even one chapter which you didn't read in the Zhuangzi, called the Webbed Toes chapter, which speaks explicitly about people with a sixth finger. And finally, we have many stories about cutting down trees. In one particular example, we have a chapter called The Mountain Tree, which speaks of a huge tree on top of a mountain which doesn't get cut down and hence lives to a long and ripe old age. Now, the basic point of each of the iterations of the useless tree parable in the Zhuangzi is that trees which are too deformed or too large do not get cut down because they are not useful. Hence, the basic message is that being useless to society is a good way to live. In the Chinese original, this is derived from a pun on two words, both pronounced in Mandarin, cai, which mean alternately timber or talent. Just like you don't want to be timber, which gets cut up and made into useful lumber for people, you also don't want to be a talent who is used by the powers that be and maybe has a shortened life as a result. However, these parables are given an ironic invocation in King of Trees. The story says several times in different ways that the student teams are clear-cutting the forest on these mountains, not to actually take those trees and ship them off to turn into lumber. Instead, they are just cutting them down, and these trees are then burned off at the end of the story to clear them away. The point is to clear the mountainsides and make them empty so that useful trees can later be harvested. So this has an exactly opposite implication to the use of this same image in the Zhuangzi. In this story, the King of Trees is cut down precisely because it is useless. Similarly, when we compare this to Nabi Xiao's banishment to this region and his eventual death, we could see that he is also banished and excluded and ultimately dies because he could not fit in with the regular order of the army and the expectations which Cultural Revolution era China placed upon him. Opting out of society was just not an option under Mao. This was a totalitarian society. It was not enough just to simply avoid resisting the political order. It's not enough to be quietly obedient. Everyone was required to actively and wholeheartedly support and participate in the construction of a radically new socialist China. Now, neither China nor Canada today is a totalitarian state, like the one in which the sent-down youth were expected to dedicate their entire lives to building the nation. However, both China and Canada, and for that matter, most other contemporary nations, do teach children that they have certain patriotic duties to society and to the nation as a whole. Now, you probably won't be killed if you decide not to fulfill those duties. But is this the best way for you to live? Do you really want to think about your life as owing something to the nation? Ah Cheng's story challenges us to think about what rights others might have to expect us to fit in. If the demands placed upon us by contemporary society are too strong to escape, can Daoism still be relevant? Or do we just have to decide this is of historical interest, but it just won't work today?